you're championing this thing or you're really good at it, or that, how seriously we might take it. And it's like, at the end of the day, we're like not even a drop in the bucket,
Yeah.
So anyway, this idea of localism, I know that you had written this article recently in See Together magazine, which is great. But yeah, what's your kind of take on it? Because you've been thinking a lot more about it, and it's part of your academic studies.
Yeah, I'm actually finishing an article now, which is some work that I presented at a surf studies conference in San Diego in April at San Diego State. And so the crux of that research and that kind of line of thinking is around looking at localism as multiple and relative and subjective, right? So we're not just talking about localism, is it good or bad, yes or no?
Right.
But really kind of digging into the underlying aspects of what different types of localism are doing in the water and on land. So relationships related to colonialism, neocolonialism, so new kind of more covert or subtle ways that places are being colonized through surfing tourism, or even through ownership and access that you mentioned before, particularly in California as an interesting example. And really kind of interrogating the ways that the ways that localism is practiced and how it's either perpetuating these modes of colonial interaction in the ocean and how that might have some impact or be a reflection of ways that we're interacting as people on land as well. And then seeing if certain expressions of localism could actually be seen as forms of resistance to neocolonialism in surfing. So for example, we can compare some of the examples that you've mentioned. The Lunada Bay surf gangs in Malibu, they're notorious for being in a very elite neighborhood where access is privatized to the beach. And if anyone who isn't from that community tries to show up and surf there, they're notorious for, getting in fights or vandalizing cars. So again, that's kind of an elite expression of a self-determined localism. But then if you go a little bit deeper, right, who are these people? How do they have access to the beach? How are they able to own property there? So they're the beneficiaries resulting from generations of privilege through capitalist constructs of economy, colonization of indigenous territories, and they're the ones who are self-designating themselves then as the locals who then are justified in their own idealized right to police this surf break that they consider theirs. So that's very different then from someone who could be living in this town we were talking about in Mexico, who are doing similar things in the water, kind of policing the way that people have access to take waves, not necessarily respecting this rule of right of way that we talk about in surfing as being a rule that's kind of an agreed upon idea that has a lot of gray area, as you were mentioning. But you know that it's their place, right? And you know that you're a visitor in their place, and they make that known when you're there. And they do it in a way, to me, that feels very different than how it's being done in a place like Lunada Bay, for example, mostly given their relationship to foreigners who are coming in. So they had an experience where they had a very hyped televised contest. What was that called? It was the... wow, my brain isn't working. Anyway, I'll get you the name of the contest. It's literally, I write about it all the time, but for some reason it's not coming to mind right now. Somewhere in Mexico contest where, there we go. I think that's actually what it's called, Somewhere in Mexico.
I know that one.
You know that one. And their spot got on the map immediately, right? And then they were flooded with visitors. And then around that is when they decided to come together as a community and start this surf tourism management model. So their localism is within this larger surf tourism management framework. So whether we're seeing them defending a place that's their community, we can also think about it as defending a commons, an ocean place as a commons. So they're regulating the way that people can experience that sort of commons. And that's a lot of the research that I'm doing now, is looking at the ways that as surfers and as communities, localism is a way of managing a commons, whether it's defining boundaries, setting up rules, restricting access in certain ways, or if it's defending nature and people from these encroaching interests that are coming in the name of surf tourism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking even just in terms of the water itself, like the lineup. You know, when you go to some far destinations and you know that people have, you know, gone really far to get there, and this sense of entitlement, like I came to get my waves and I'm going to get my waves, and then the locals kind of have to, like, you know, stop it right there. You know, it's like, you know, everyone just chill out, because we're not here for you to, you know, for your 1 week to get what you need and leave. You know, it's, again, that idea of tourism, like you go there to get what you need and you know, leave. You just like don't care about what happens after you leave. Yeah. And I think it's, oh God, I lost my train of thought.
Since we're in the same boat today.
Yeah, my brain is a little, you know, I've given up coffee recently, so I have still in like brain fog. Oh gosh, what was I talking about? Anyway, oh gosh, what were you just saying?
Let's see if we can go back in time.
We're talking about the big surf contest that has no name, no name surf contest,
and how localism could potentially be a way to create rules, set boundaries. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you know, remains to be seen. But how it's being done in different ways by different people and doing different things in these different places.
Actually, you know, my other question that has to do with that is, I mean, couldn't the communities who, you know, who live in a certain place and they pay their taxes and whatnot, like, couldn't they make that same argument? Like, we pay for the, you know, I mean, you know, this is where it gets a little ridiculous, because then it's like, well, then who's local? Like, how close do you have to live to that break? Do you have to be the person who can surf there every single day? Like, you know, like, I don't live right on the beach, but I have my, you know, the breaks that I frequent, and you know, when we get swell and things move around a lot, and you find yourself like 2 jetties down, like all of a sudden there's like a new crew, and it's like, so are you guys the locals now, or like, am I by extension still local because I usually surf 2 breaks down? Like it gets silly after a while, you know. It's like, what's local? Yeah,
I think my favorite definition I've heard of localism in surfing is anyone who's been there a day longer than you is a local. God.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, how do you determine that when you're in the lineup? And I think I want to segue, I think, to when we met at that amazing place in Costa Rica that unfortunately had a terrible, it's kind of isolated, but a really not unsavory kind of local expat community. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to use the word local, but they're an expat community that has been going there for many years. And I know one guy, and he's amazing, and he stays out of the kind of like the local politics, but of the expats. But the idea of, again, like how, you know, they claim local status, but on the same token, they don't live there. They probably don't pay taxes there. They don't give back to the community. But there is such a kind of severe localism that they exert to people who haven't been going there as long, or people who are, you know, they're on holiday. But to me, in my experience that time, it was constantly a changing of the goalpost. And on top of that, being a woman, and all these guys were guys, and then how there's that kind of intersection of this idea of localism, and then how it expresses itself in terms of gender. You know, this idea of localism, it seems so arbitrary. You know, when you really break it down to all these different contexts, it starts to kind of sound crazy. You know, like, so I remember this one break. This guy, he literally took every single wave, and you know, I dropped in on him because I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, you know, and then I pulled out because we were just too close, but it was to make a point. And then his friend is like, you know, you dropped in on my friend, you should look. And I was like, you have no idea. No, he just caught the last 3 waves. Like, and he's like, well, he's lived here for 20 years. And I was like, that's not how it works. And, you know, and then ultimately my friend introduced us and we were fine. And his friend felt like a fucking idiot, you know, because he, you know, and also his impulse to like police me, you know,
Yep.
and assume that I was wrong, not knowing, you know, or not paying attention. Or he has his own wonky rules of what it's supposed to be like in the water. So that's another thing. Like everyone has their own wonky sense of like what's right, you know, what you can do in the lineup, what's right and what's wrong. And so, you know, when we talk about localism and, you know, like where do we draw that line? Like, you know, I come there, I don't know if you've lived there 10 years and the next guy's lived there for 1 week and another guy's like, you know, vacationing. Like it just starts to seem crazy. And then the irony is that whenever we did surf with Costa Ricans, they were so generous, calling you into waves, just lovely, you know, chit-chatting and in a very respectful way, whereas I felt like the expats who were there, you know, I mean, you can share your story about that guy who was also hogging waves, who just recently moved there. And, well, you tell the story.
Well, I have a few stories actually from that place where you and I met.
Which we won't mention
Somewhere
where it
in
is.
Costa Rica. There you go.
No name, Costa Rica.
No name,
yeah.
Costa Rica. Yeah, and they touch on a lot of these different relationships we have to the experience of localism expressed in the water. And I guess just to give it kind of some structure around how we can conceptualize of different types of localism, the way that I have kind of started a categorization of it, and I have, you know, a whole flow chart and everything in my in my academic work around it.
It's not legit until there's a flow chart.
Exactly, and I've never made a chart for anything academic, and I felt pretty proud about it. It's almost like a map, a mind map. Anyway, that's to be revealed in the future, but for now...
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. For now, we can kind of loosely look at some categories, and we can think about localism of privilege, localism of resistance, and localism of subversion, which could be something that's really challenging these very entrenched systems and structures of power that dominate and oppress and repress people.
How does that look like?
So, for example, it could be someone who, you know, a woman surfer, for example, who's going to a place and exerting a very specific type of localism that is based on equality, equity, and freedom for women in the water that may be completely disruptive or disrespective. Disrespective? No.
Disrespectful?
There it is. That's my English-Spanish problems at this point. Those endings of words get mixed up. Disrespectful of what would be considered the rules of surfing. Again, I always ask the question, whose rules? How do those rules get started? But I'm not going to go into that. But I have in other written things that I've done. And I do in this piece as well in an academic way. Again, so how are you using your sense of localism in a way that is disruptive to these larger power structures? So a local person in Costa Rica, a local surfer, could do that to disrupt sort of this entitlement from a California surfer who might have moved there 30 years ago, bought up some coastal property, and now consider themselves owners both there on land and in the water, right? So a local Costa Rican surfer might be exerting his localism by saying no and taking the waves that they want vis-a-vis this person who is exerting this sort of ownership in this very kind of colonizing way. And then as a woman, I might be in your position and seeing this man who has his sort of colonial entitlement to waves, and you're saying, no, he's just taken off on every single wave, just paddling right past me. We're both sitting at the peak. I'm going, you know? So that's an expression of a type of localism that could be used as a means of subverting those power dynamics. So challenging them, disrupting them, saying no. So again, these lines of categories of localism, they're not like set categories. There's a lot of overlap. And it also depends on your subjective position. Like if I'm the guy in that position, I might have something to say about that from my positionality of who I am, how I came to be in Costa Rica. Maybe. experienced a type of localism in California that he was fleeing to find some freedom. Who knows?
Right.
Again, so I have had situations where there have just been very openly misogynistic expressions